So Dr. Lajevardi received her PhD from the University of San Diego in 2017 and her JD in 2012 from the University of San Francisco's Law School. Her work mostly focused on issues related to race and ethnic politics, political behavior, voting rights, and immigration. And her latest book, Outsiders at Home, The Politics of American Islamophobia, offers the first systematic examination of the status of Muslim Americans in U.S. democracy. Now I get to talk about why I know her. Dr. Lajevardi came to MSU in 2018, and even with a pandemic that seems like it's never ending, taking up a huge chunk of that time, she has undoubtedly made her mark here. In addition to being an exceptional mentor and professor, and I've had her for both, and I can't say she's exceptional, she's also a phenomenal researcher, which is why it's no surprise that the University of Oxford has requested that she be a visiting professor there for the upcoming school year. Dr. Lajevardi's presentation today is entitled "Why Hostility Towards Muslims Matters for Politics." And I'm not going to keep rambling on and on about how much I love her, but I'm going to let her go on with her presentation.
Oh, thank you, Jasmine. You embarrassed me, but I just have to say that it's so nice to be here with all of you, with this MSU family. It's been a long time since I've been in Michigan. I left in October and moved to Sweden. I moved all my things into my office and came across the globe to Sweden, where I thought I could work in an office, and then they shut down for the pandemic. So I've just been sitting out here, in a different country where, anyways, here we are, 1 year later. But, it's really been a special time at MSU, and I have to say that early on when I first arrived, Dr. Waller actually met me and included me in so many different things at MSU, and it was actually so helpful, and it was so welcoming, and Dr. Waller, you really created a home for me at MSU, and so I appreciate that. And on top of that, I get to work with Jasmine and other marvelous students, and we get to study race and ethnicity in America. And what better place to do that than Michigan State, where, people are open to asking questions and they're not afraid to ask questions and to enter into dialogue. And so anyways, being here with you today is just a very unique privilege. And so thank you so much for this invitation. Today I'm going to be talking about my book, but I'm going to also talk about who American Muslims are. I'm not going to go into super big detail about my book. I'm going to sort of preview what I do and provide some answers, but this is sort of a large sort of bird's eye view of what we should know about American Muslims and American democracy. And if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I think Dr. Waller said that he would pose them of me. It's kind of hard to multitask on this screen. Everything kind of just shuts down. So I can't see all of you, but I just want to say thank you so much for being so accommodating and showing up at noon during your lunchtime. It's 6 p.m. here, so otherwise I think we would have been heading towards midnight had we stayed during your original time. So, okay, so here we go. Who are American Muslims? This is probably a good place to start. Not a lot of people know who American Muslims are, so I'm going to give us a bit of a background on who they might be. So Islam in the United States and globally, I think, is a really important place to start. In the world, there's an estimated 1.6 to 2.1 billion Muslim adherents. And when you take those numbers into account, actually, Islam constitutes the second largest religious group behind Christianity in the world. It is also the fastest growing religion in the world today. So the Muslim population is forecasted to increase by 35% over the next 20 years. And if you look towards the United States, the Pew Research Center estimates that as of 2017, there are currently 3.45 million Muslims living in America today. But actually, as you're going to see later on, this number is really hard for us to calculate because the US Census doesn't ask any questions about the size of the Muslim population. There's no questions on religion. And even if you try to maybe guess how many Muslims there might be by capturing the number of Middle Easterners, you can't do this because Muslims in America are actually counted as white if they're from the Middle East. On top of that, just to kind of give you a background on religious breakdowns in the United States, the CIA fact book lists the largest religions in the world. oh, sorry, in the world, not in the United States, in the following order. So Christians are about 33%, Muslims are about 23%, Hindus are about 14%, Buddhists are 7%, Sikhs are less than 1%, Jews are less than 25%, and Baha'is are at about 0.1%. So what about Muslims in America? So many Muslims in the United States are newcomers. This is true. In fact, a Pew study found that between 1992 and 2012, approximately 1.7 million of the 3 whatever million I just said, they actually entered the United States as legal permanent residents. That's within a 20-year period. So this is a pretty large sum of folks that are coming to the United States rather recently. And this number jumped from about 50,000 Muslims in 1992 to 100,000 that came in 2012. But it's important to realize that Muslims have actually been in the United States since our country's founding. In the early 16th century, there was most notably a man named Estefan who accompanied the Spanish as a guide to the New World in the early 16th century in their conquest of what would later become Arizona and New Mexico. And then in the 1600s, our best estimates surmise that a large subset of enslaved Africans who were forcibly brought to the United States were actually of the Muslim faith. Estimates actually suggest that about 30% of enslaved Africans who arrived to the United States were of Muslim faith. And so when you take that into account, Muslims have been in the United States in one way or another for at least 400 years. Here are some insights from the Pew 2017 survey. Why do we care about the Pew Research Center? The Pew Research Center invests over $1 million every few years to survey the American Muslim population. And they have, to our opinion, the best estimates of the Muslim population because they use random digit telephone dialing, which is incredibly expensive these days when you're trying to run surveys. And so they conducted one of these surveys in the aftermath of the 2016 election, and they surveyed American Muslims then. And this is the third of its kind. They had a survey in 2007, one in 2011, and now in 2017. And it's really just the most representative survey that we've got. In this survey, we learned that only 24% of Muslims are US born with US born parents. In fact, most Muslims, about 58% of them, are immigrants and were born abroad. Only 18% of US Muslims are people like me, people who were born here but whose parents were born abroad. And so that means that we can't really think about US Muslims without thinking about migration and immigration policy. There's also a great deal of racial diversity among US Muslims. We typically have really broad ways of labeling minorities. For instance, Asian American, that can actually count quite a few different groups of people. And all of these varieties of differences in national origin are all encapsulated by what we call these, quote, pan-ethnic terms. And sometimes when we think about Muslims, we actually are hiding the kind of variation, the racial variation that exists among this group. I think most importantly, I want to highlight that 1/5 of American Muslims are Black. 41% identify as white, but as I earlier mentioned, this is because the white category is actually hiding those from the Middle East and North Africa. Really interestingly, 8% of the Muslim population identifies as Latinx. So recall how I just mentioned that foreign-born US immigrants constitute 58% of the US Muslim population. What's really interesting is that this survey reveals that also a majority of these people, 56% of them, arrived in the United States in the year 2000 or later, making them quite recent arrivals. And only 35% of foreign-born Muslim immigrants came to the US between 1970 and 1999. So I think this is really interesting. My parents came to the United States between 1970 and 1979, and that's about 3% of the Muslim population in the US. So I think that's really remarkable, at least thinking about my own background. So in this next plot, you can see here that despite a majority of Muslims being foreign-born, a majority of these individuals are actually naturalized US citizens, which makes them relevant in politics, right? with the right to vote through your citizenship, you become relevant in American politics. And so in the US Muslim population overall, we have 82% that are citizens and have the right to vote, indicating a very valuable voter base, many of whom are located in the state of Michigan, but also in a number of swing states that we should at least be thinking about for those of us who are political scientists in terms of American elections. Finally, I really like this table because it indicates so much about where Muslims have immigrated from. It kind of gives us a background in terms of where they're coming from, and especially since we don't get to see any of this in the census. And it also sort of indicates how reductive our racial categories are. So if you consider this right-hand column, you can see, this one right here, you can see that 42% were born in the United States, 20% were born somewhere in South Asia, about 27%, if you add up these two numbers, were born in the Middle East or other Asian country, 5% are from Sub-Saharan Africa, 2% are from Europe, and 2% are from the Americas, apart from the US. So that kind of gives us some background on where folks are from. Finally, I'm going to highlight two demographic points. The first is the number of US Muslims has grown substantially from 2007 to 2017, from 2.3 million in 2007 to 3.45 million in 2017. So just in 10 years, you see this growth of over a million people in the United States. So this is rather important. Second, Pew estimates that by 2040, Muslims will actually replace American Jews as the nation's second largest religious group after Christians. That's 2040, that's in 20 years. And by 2050, in 30 years, the US Muslim population is projected to reach 8 million, or 2.1% of the nation's total population, nearly twice its share today. And finally, US Muslims are actually a really young population. Their median age is 35, while the median age in the United States among the general public is about 47. So that indicates that their political voice is only likely going to grow as they reach voting age. So I want to talk a little bit about my book, and I kind of want to start with the motivation behind it. What is the status of Muslims in American democracy? That's the main question that I ask in this book. And maybe I'll come back here real quick just to show you the image on this book. This is an academic book. It may not look like one, but it is. And I was very deliberate in designing the cover because I wanted the cover to reflect somebody who is observing the totality of what Muslims are experiencing in America today. And so you can see reflected in this character sunglasses, protesters who are holding signs in a protest that say together, Muslims go back home. And you can see the frown in her eyebrows and her lips being tilted downwards, indicating a sign of unhappiness. At the same time, this woman appears quite young. She has a very loose-fitting veil, indicating that she's not extremely religious, but that she adheres to the faith, as well as that she's observing something happening in her like nearby vicinity that is causing her a bit of distress. And so when I ask what is the status of Muslims in American democracy, this is rooted in an argument, which I'm going to outline for you now. So I argue that current hostility towards the American Muslim population in our sociopolitical context today is high, but that this hostility is nothing new because Muslims have long been portrayed as being in opposition to a more elevated, democratic, and modern West. And so while there have been significant demographic shifts in the group's composition since their early arrival in the 1600s, the marginalization of American Muslims has been manifest to different degrees over the centuries. So as I indicated earlier, right, though the Islam that was brought by enslaved Africans did not endure very long, since many were forcibly converted to Christianity, efforts to practice Islam persisted. They were conducted in secret. And this is really interesting because being forced to convert to a different religion. But the fact that this tradition of Islam still manifests among many descendants of enslaved people, especially, for instance, on the Georgia coast, is really a testament to the endurance of marginalized people, but also to the fact that Islamophobia has been manifest in different ways, and it has existed and has targeted different Muslim populations over time. So despite a very long history of discrimination, I argue that there is particular concern about the status of Muslims in America today. So in the post 9/11 era and well before the Trump presidency, the United States has endorsed or overseen legislation, policies, and interventions that have affected the lives of Muslims, both foreign and domestic. You can think of, for instance, the Patriot Act, the establishment of Guantanamo Bay Prison, the Iraq War, the Abu Ghraib prison scandal, the creation of the Controlled Application Review and Resolution Program, which targets those who are aspiring for US citizenship, but kept excluding applicants from the Arab world, the Middle East, and Muslim and South Asian communities in these populations. So why might we be concerned about the status of Muslims in recent times? I'm going to provide us some reasons here. First, political elites linked them with the 9/11 attacks. So for example, President George W. Bush, while visiting the Islamic Center of Washington, D.C. less than 1 week after the attacks, made a statement that while well-intentioned in nature, created an association between Muslims and the terrorist attacks implicitly. He said, "Like the good folks standing with me, the American people were appalled and outraged at last Tuesday's attacks. And so were Muslims all across the world. Both Americans and Muslim friends and citizens, tax-paying citizens, and Muslims and nations were appalled and could not believe what we saw on our TV screens. These acts of violence against innocents violate the fundamental tenets of the Islamic faith, and it's important for my fellow Americans to understand that the face of terror is not the true faith of Islam. That is not what Islam is about. Islam is about peace. These terrorists don't represent peace." So the message here is the terrorist attacks were not about Muslims, they're not about Islam. But he distinguishes Americans and Muslim friends and citizens, like as if these two things cannot be the same, and creates an association between Muslims and Islam with the attacks. This lingered. If you read the Patriot Act, Section 102 has a very similar passage where there is an intention to not discriminate against Muslims written directly into the Patriot Act. Another reason is that there's been widespread surveillance programs and prolonged detentions. So I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with this, but the NSA also launched a warrantless national surveillance program that lasted from 2001 to 2007, which confirmed many Muslims' own suspicions that their calls and email communications had been subject to warrantless searches. So years after this unlawful program was launched, The Intercept actually reported that the NSA and FBI had been covertly monitoring the emails of prominent Muslim Americans. There were a number of incidents as well. For instance, the NYPD infiltrated the Muslim Students Association at Yale. So there was a jurisdictional issue there, but also there was infiltration into even student groups that was happening around this time. There was also a rise in anti-Muslim bias incidents in legislation. So the Council on American Islamic Relations reports, basically Muslims can report to them if they've faced a bias incident or hate crime. And what you can see is that in 2014, there were about 3,300 reports. This rises to about 3,700, and then the election year rises to 4,200, and it goes down in 2017 and 2018. But I want to show you what kind of incidents are being reported. Mostly that the harassment seems to be coming from the FBI and other federal agencies, as well as hate crimes and harassment that really seem to dominate what folks are experiencing. There's also been a rise in anti-Sharia laws. I don't know if anyone's heard of those, but these are laws that several states have passed or attempted to pass that are designed to prevent courts from applying what is known as Sharia law or Islamic law, but really in the legislation itself, foreign or international law in their rulings. These laws are more symbolic than anything else because the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment of the Constitution actually prohibits the government from making any law respecting the establishment of religion and mandates that no religious tradition can actually be established. So any form of Sharia is actually not, it violates the First Amendment. But these laws are more performative in nature because they single out Sharia, they single out Muslims, and they argue that it solely violates the First Amendment by treating one belief system as suspect. And many have argued, in fact, that these anti-Sharia laws, they represent a form of institutionalized Islamophobia because they actually cannot be implemented. And there's an argument that they're being introduced and enacted so as to create fear among populations. And just to give you an idea of how pervasive these are, this is just a plot here of anti-Sharia law bills in the United States that have been introduced and enacted. From 2010 to 2017, 201 were introduced and 14 were actually enacted in state legislatures. Of course, there was the 2016 presidential campaign, which coincided with the Syrian refugee crisis, as well as the rise of ISIS. And I want to sort of highlight a few legislator comments that were made about Muslims as the primary season took off in 2015. John Bennett, who was an Oklahoma state representative, stated, "American Muslims are a cancer that must be cut out of America." David Bowers, who was the mayor of Roanoke, Virginia, called for the registration and subsequent incarceration of Muslims in US internment camps. Ben Carson, who was a previous Republican presidential contender, compared Syrian refugees, many of whom are Muslim, to rabid dogs. Donald Trump called for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the US. In 2016, Trump stated that the US should surveil Muslims in this country, particularly at mosques. And Ted Cruz called for the wholesale policing of Muslim neighborhoods in the US in the wake of the Brussels attacks. There was, of course, also the Muslim ban. On January 27th, 2017, President Trump signed Executive Order 13769, which denied citizens of 7 Muslim majority countries entry into the United States. There were then 2 subsequent executive orders that changed some of this language, issued on March 6, 2017 and September 24th, 2017, and this was upheld by the Supreme Court in Trump versus Hawaii in 2018. So I've shown you a lot of anecdotal signs, but these signs are quite limited in nature. So it seems like the US Muslim experience in the United States might actually be quite negative, and that Muslim Americans may be one of the most politically and socially stigmatized groups in the United States. But actually the evidence of a backlash is largely conjecture, and Muslim Americans remain woefully understudied. And at least in academia, we need more systematic and quantitative empirical research, I would argue, in several domains on US Muslims in order to understand their experiences in American sociopolitical life. But as I hinted earlier, there's a number of empirical limitations that arise when you try to study American Muslims. First, we don't know the true size and composition of the population. We have some estimates like from Pew, but actually we don't know. As I mentioned earlier, we don't have a census category for religion. And because the white category includes anyone who is from the Middle East or North Africa, if we just try to estimate the size of the Muslim population by using, a Middle Eastern or North African proxy, we can't do that because that white category hides everything for us. Importantly, there's also very few publicly available public opinion surveys on Muslims, Islam, or even Muslim Americans before 9/11. So if you want to kind of understand how the public thinks about Muslim Americans before 9/11, we actually can't do that very much because we haven't been asking them questions on surveys before that time. So I wrote this book, and I'm going to provide a book outline and answers, and then we can move on to Q&A. So my book, Outsiders at Home, conducts a comprehensive study of how US Muslims are treated in a number of different domains that we care about politically that are vital to democratic inclusion in order to understand how they fare in American democracy. So here we go. I'm going to do book outline. These are the questions that I pose throughout the book. The first is, how does anti-Muslim hostility matter for shaping candidate and policy support? So this is an important question because anti-Muslim hostility was really high around the 2016 election, and it seemed to be linked to Trump support. But to study that link was really hard because not a lot of people had been thinking about anti-Muslim hostility at all, really. So to answer this question, I developed a set of survey items that measured prejudice towards US Muslims called the, quote, Muslim American Resentment Scale. And across 10 surveys, I measured how the Muslim American Resentment Scale, compared to other prejudice items, predicted support for President Trump during the primary season as well as during the election. I also tackled the question of political representation. I asked, how do Muslims fare in terms of substantive representation? Substantive representation is what we refer to when we are thinking about whether or not representatives are representing the actual interests of their constituents. So they don't have to look like me, they don't have to descriptively look like me, but when they're in office, do they pursue policies that I care about, that their constituents care about? So how do Muslims fare in terms of substantive representation? For instance, are they ignored by their elected representatives? Here, I ran 2 experiments. They're called audit studies on actual state legislators. There's about 7,200 of them across the nation, and I reached about 6,600 of them. I ran an experiment in study 1, and then in the second study, I did about half of that. In order to assess bias when fictional Muslim constituents asked them for a constituency service. Third, I was curious about the news media. So I asked, how did the news media historically depict Muslims, both foreign and domestic, in its news coverage? And does news media matter for shaping public attitudes? So here what I did was I examined the portrayals of Muslims on CNN, Fox, and MSNBC from 1992 to 2015. And I assessed how frequently they were portrayed and discussed in the news media on these 3 platforms. And I examined how their coverage compared to other groups like Blacks, Latinos, and Asian Americans. And then I evaluated how positive or negative the coverage was compared to other groups, and whether there was a change in their coverage over time. And then I ran some studies and exposed people to some of this news coverage and found that exposure to, well, I'm not going to preview the answer yet, but I wanted to see how exposure to the news coverage might have shifted people's attitudes towards Muslims. I then looked at whether or not the mass public, so the average American, would be willing to vote for a Muslim American candidate. So certainly there aren't enough Muslims out there to elect, all these Muslim candidates. But, if the public is willing to elect a Muslim candidate, then perhaps there is, some hope for what we call descriptive representation, which is when people who belong to your own group, whether that be your gender group, your sexual orientation group, your race group, your religious group, whatever it might be, when they are representing you and you belong to the same group as them, that's called descriptive representation. So what are their prospects for descriptive representation? Here, I tested whether the American electorate would vote for a fictional Muslim elected official when given the opportunity in 2 survey experiments. And finally, I examined the extent to which US Muslims reported experiencing political discrimination. So you know, the first 4 parts of this book are really looking at public attitudes towards Muslims. And in the last section, I flip the lens. And here I'm looking at, well, how does this feel to US Muslims themselves? How much do they report experiencing societal and institutional discrimination? And here I ran surveys of US Muslims. So I'm going to preview my answers now. First, turning to public opinion and anti-Muslim hostility. I find that across numerous policies, Muslim American resentment or anti-Muslim hostility is stronger in its predictive power than other previously proposed items or measures of group attitudes. In the book, I showed that across numerous policies, this anti-Muslim hostility measure that I created is stronger than others, and that it surpasses standard racial resentment measures, and that it's very strong in predicting candidate support and vote choice for Trump. So after partisanship, I find that the most important indicator for Trump support in 2016 was anti-Muslim hostility. Turning to the question of political representation, as I mentioned, I ran studies on elected officials. I ran 2 studies. They're called audit studies. And these studies revealed vast substantive discrimination. I found that Muslim voices were systematically ignored by their elected representatives. Ordinary American Muslims were unable to access a political career at the same rate as their white counterparts, regardless of socioeconomic status. I found that when asking for an application for an internship for the summer, the fictional Muslim applicant did not have higher chances of being offered even an application for an internship when they indicated that they had high socioeconomic status, which I indicated through having a degree from Harvard. Moreover, though Muslims strongly identify with the Democratic Party today, they do not have strong allies among Democratic representatives. They were not more willing than their Republican counterparts to help Muslims. And so the implications of these studies was really disconcerting. I found that Muslim voices were systematically ignored by their representatives and even by those who they view as allies. Next, turning to the news media, I evaluated cable news media, as I indicated earlier. And what I found is that cable news media coverage of Muslims has been really high, especially in recent times, but it's actually been quite negative throughout the 20-year period that I studied. The volume actually was high enough to rival other stigmatized groups in the US, especially Latinos. I found that media coverage of Muslims and Muslim Americans has been increasing in volume, but much more so for the foreign group, Muslims globally. Also, I find that media portrayals are really informative insofar as they reveal that Muslims and Muslim Americans have been communicated quite negatively to the public, but also can influence public opinion. So exposure to negative portrayals about Muslims and Muslim Americans actually generated negative attitudes about the domestic group. So being exposed to negative coverage about the foreign group has consequences for how we view the domestic group. Next, when I look at Muslim candidate support and their prospects for descriptive representation, I find that these prospects are quite low. Muslim candidates who run as Democrats are actually they're much less able to be elected, but chances of them being elected is much higher when they run as Republicans. But of course, there's a low probability of that occurring. Finally, US Muslims experience a great deal of societal and institutional discrimination. They worry about their visibility. They regularly avoid public places, and in response to the Trump Muslim ban, they reported feeling more visible and more open to attack. So in conclusion, this book asked, how do Muslim Americans fare in American democracy? And answering this really broad question requires a multifaceted approach. The totality of the evidence in this book, I argue, provides empirical evidence of the degenerating status of Muslims in America. And I also argue that the results of all of these studies show that the group situation is actually much more worse than we might have previously imagined. This kind of discrimination is not inconsequential. Muslim Americans are deprived of fair treatment in the socio-political context, and they are acutely aware of their poor positionality in the American political arena. And the totality of these results, I argue, indicates that Muslim Americans experience substantial hostility and discrimination in the American political context. And with that, I thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Nazita. Would you mind, oh, perfect. That's great, thank you. That was terrific, really fascinating. Jasmine, I know that you've got to leave at 1. Do you want to begin the Q&A and then I take over at 1?
Sure, that works.
So Jasmine's new to the system too, but I think everybody here knows the ropes. So please just where you raise your hand or write question or write out your question in the chat box. Oh, Irv, go.
This mute button, huh?
Yeah. You're muted, Irv.
Can you unmute him, Dr. Waller?
I don't think I can. I can click ask to unmute.
Yeah, if you click ask to unmute.
Oh, there you are.
Oh, I want to know how in the world you did all of this work in a decade. It is an amazing group of studies. You must have had dozens of people helping conduct this.
You're very kind. I had a lot of very generous people who took pity on me and let me pick their brains and, you know, put survey items on their surveys, and just the kindness of others really, really was so helpful. And I had, I think, just the most wonderful friends during this period, people who I never knew how. Can you imagine getting 20 years of CNN broadcasts? 20 years of CNN you know how many broadcasts? We're talking millions of CNN shows. And CNN is not that creative. They actually repeat a lot of their broadcasts, especially in the 90s. They didn't fill up 24 hours of coverage. I mean, it was content, and they just replayed and replayed. And I didn't know how to do any of that. But I had friends in physics who did. And I just would buy them beer and some pizza, and, you know, I would just go to their house and kind of sit on their couch and say, hey, like, have a beer, help me. You know, I'm like, once we figure problem 1, I'm like, okay, here's a whiskey. Like, what about this next problem? You know? It was really fun. It was, you know, I'm so indebted to people who really helped me think about how to paint a more comprehensive landscape. And I don't know if you caught that. I'm an attorney, and when I was an attorney, and we were taught it's the totality of the evidence. The evidentiary burden is met with the totality of the evidence, right? That's what the court cares about. And to me, this whole job is about, you know, the totality of the evidence. We're here to build an overwhelming evidentiary standard. And
well, I'm going to see that our Democratic representatives get copies of your books without a doubt.
Thank you.
So we have a question in the chat, Dr. Lajevardi. With Michigan's large Arab population, how does Michigan appear as far as discrimination against Muslims, especially with our Republican-dominated state Senate and House?
Well, that's a really good question. You know, in Michigan, what's been really interesting is that I've run a few studies here, and I found that the Michigan population distinguishes between Arab and Muslim. Actually, Michiganders know a difference between Arab and Muslim. They are like the only people in this country that understand the differences, that there can actually be Arab Christians, Arab Baha'is, Arab Jews. They understand that there's heterogeneity there. And they actually hold quite favorable attitudes towards Arab, but they hold negative attitudes towards Muslims. And so they penalize Muslims, but they don't penalize Arabs. And so when you're Arab and Muslim, you get that penalty. But when you just claim to be Arab, you don't get penalized. So there's the public opinion situation in Michigan is really interesting. And you don't see that happen in anywhere else, actually. So I think it's because, of course, this large Arab population. So discrimination, once people know who you are, looks different, right? Once they have sort of an understanding of who you are, the discrimination is really tailored to, are you Arab, Muslim, or Arab and Muslim? But what's realistic, I think that we should probably have a more candid conversation about this, is that most people don't know an Arab person personally, nor do they know a Muslim person personally. And that when you don't know them personally, actually hold quite negative attitudes towards members of these groups, even if you reside in an area with a large population. And so that's been really problematic for these populations. Particularly in the wake of 2017, there was a rise in hate crimes in the state against these groups because folks don't know, and so there's not a lot of distinguishing that's happening. And so I would say that the situation in Michigan is probably, it's probably very unique because people actually can draw these distinctions when they know the difference. But that usually they're not sticking around to figure out the difference, right? They're kind of just jumping to, they're sort of making quick decisions, right? We're just using information cues because we have like a million things going on at Target, you know, we just like picking something up and jumping out the door. And so when these sort of incidents happen in public spaces, we're not putting a lot of thought behind them. So, you know, I'm an optimist sometimes. You know, like if the weather's good and, you know, the sun's shining, like I can be kind of optimistic and say we've turned a corner. And I think we are turning a corner in Michigan, at least, where you see folks actually starting to distinguish. And like I said, it's only in Michigan that I've seen anything like this in the data. I don't know if that really answered your question, but hopefully it provides some context.
If no one else, oh, Dr. Waller has a question, but I had a question, I unmuted first.
Okay.
I just wanted to know, because of the census, I know there's like a mini census that goes on like every 5 years, and then, you know, like the census that goes on every 10.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it just seems to me that like 2030 is kind of late to start measuring Middle Eastern people in this country. I think it's kind of crazy how we would qualify them as white, or North Africans as white as well. And it must be horrible to try to research when you can't use census data like everyone else does. So like, what are our chances of getting a MENA category onto the census in 2030 or the mini census in 2025?
Oh, thank you, Jasmine. That's a great question. God, my optimism is slowly going down, you guys. See how fast that was? It was just like a sine curve. So in 2020, we were supposed to have a MENA category. I don't know if you guys knew that or not. But in 2015, the Office of Management and Budget put out a directive and said, we're going to start testing for a MENA category. It is time. In 2015. Then they spent millions of dollars, millions and millions and millions of dollars piloting what happens when we give people the option to select Middle East, North Africa, or white. Where do these groups select? And they overwhelmingly, like by 80–90%, select the MENA category. They overwhelmingly feel an attachment to the MENA category. So not only is their actual like willingness, right, an attachment to this category, the government, when they ran these studies, found, wow, like this is actually really great. You know, we're just gonna put this on the census. Let's go and collect this data. It's gonna be great. Fantastic. And I should say the census matters for a lot of reasons, right? It gives us a way to trace some histories, right, of folks. It helps us get representation. It helps researchers figure out poverty in some of these, among some of these populations, right? It really helps us to figure out how these groups are faring without our studies, which are actually quite costly to do, and they're really not that representative unless you have millions of dollars and a really nice benefactor. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So as you can imagine, then the 2020 census is about to get going, and the new administration just cut it out. They took it out, and there have been a number of efforts by members of Congress, especially by Rashida Tlaib, in open proceedings to question experts as to why it was removed, and no such answer has been provided. This is something that comes up often in hearings, and we just don't know. I agree that 2030 is too late. I really wish we knew in 2020, you know, like as a political scientist thinking about different racial groups and how politics is changing so much, right? Like this country is, the demographics are changing, our politics are changing. It's important for us to think about how the needs of different communities need to be served through policy. And if we can't actually distinguish between these groups, then we're really not going to serve really different subsets of the population. I think I often ask people, you know, do I look white to you? And I'm curious, like, do I physically look white? Because I don't feel I look white. I feel I look Middle Eastern. I feel that way, right? I feel like, but I don't know how the world sees me. Sometimes I feel like maybe I do look white. Maybe my eyes are actually blue and I don't know. Like, maybe I'm making this up. Maybe the census is right, you know? Anyways, this is a large tangent, but that's sort of the history of the census. And that went down. Hopefully we can go back up, Dr. Waller.
Okay, Dr. Waller, go ahead with your question.
I'm not sure, we'll see. It's often, I know when Britons and Americans are in the mood for self-criticism about their own countries and say how threadbare our welfare states are, and you think, well, could things realistically be better? And then somebody's always going to chime in and say, yes, look at Scandinavia. They get it right. They charge high taxes and they have very, very substantial safety nets. But then there's the other argument that's frequently made, and it can be made from various points on the political spectrum. That's because they are ethnically homogeneous. They feel a greater sense of affinity with strangers because people look the same, and so they more easily identify with one another. And then the next argument comes along, and that is going to be jeopardized as a result of immigration. And there's a sort of, you know, there is a logic to it, but there are all sorts of assumptions that are made at every single step in that argument. What is your being able to reflect on your time in Sweden and your fantastically impressive studies of American Islamophobia? What do you think about that chain of reasoning?
It's really interesting. I mean, I'm a guest in this country. You know, I'm a short-term immigrant. I have a residence permit. In Sweden, I'm benefiting from their fantastic roads and, you know, their wonderful healthcare. I haven't used it, but, you know, I know that if anything happens, I'm going to be able to bet. So I have a lot of gratitude for what wonderful hosts they've been. But I arrived here in 2017 for my postdoc during the height of the refugee crisis. And when I got my first residence permit here, there was quite a long queue actually to get the residence permit sorted out, because they, and I don't know if you guys know this, but Sweden received the most asylum seekers per capita than any other European country. And at some point they really couldn't handle the influx, and so their migration agency was quite overwhelmed, and they've just been processing things a bit slow. And currently today, 20% of people who reside in Sweden are foreign-born. And so that might be that they were born in Norway, it might be that they were born in the United States, it might be they were born in France or whatnot, but it's a very international place, and many of the people who come here come as refugees. Like, actually coming through a work visa is very difficult. And And so they're very sort of kind with their refugee policies, but not so much with, you know, work visas, for instance. Which means that there's like kind of a classist system here. And because they're not a colonial power in the same way as, you know, the United Kingdom or France or Belgium or whatnot, they have a different relationship with immigrants here, one in which it's a bit paternalistic. You know, we Swedes are doing you X people from X countries a favor, please come here. You cannot work for 3 years. The first 3 years you're here, you have to only just take Swedish classes. 3 years of Swedish class, half a day, you cannot have a job. But once you finish your 3 years of Swedish class, then you can go find employment. But up until then, we'll cover the costs of your housing and your family and whatnot, your lodging, your food, whatever, but go learn the language. And so you can imagine that for refugees, at least who arrived here in 2017, who were in need of psychological help, I think, right? If overwhelmingly folks who arrived here to Europe during the crisis came by sea, many, I would say, have endured a substantial amount of trauma. If you're coming to a country that thinks that the trauma is best served by taking a half a day of language classes, that can be kind of hard. Probably what you need is a way to work and make friends and join clubs and go to the gym and play soccer or basketball or whatever. Probably you need ways to see doctors that speak your language so you can deal with the mental health ramifications of what it meant to lose friends and family along the way, or to have left your homeland, for instance. And so, or what it feels like to be in limbo. And so because many of these refugees are Muslim, it's been interesting to think about Islamophobia in the US versus in Sweden. I would say in Sweden, it's very much couched in, you are welcome here, but we don't want to build relationships with you. You know, like there is a resistance in creating deeper ties with these populations. There's not a lot of mixing. Whereas I think in the United States, as difficult as our conversations about race are, we are having them. As hard as it is to have them and how uncomfortable it is and how much trauma we're enduring, all of us, we're doing it. Whether we like it or not, kicking and screaming, it's happening. And here it's not. It's not. And, you know, I'm not sure it will, you know, because of the way that folks come over here, because they're coming as asylum seekers, I think. I think the institutional path to Sweden being through asylum creates such a power imbalance between citizens of this country and the state and folks who are entering that it's really hard to create more parity over time. And so, I will say one final thing, just as a rambling thought. They call folks who are born in Sweden to immigrant parents, so people like me, right? My parents immigrated in the 70s to the US. I was born in LA. They would call someone like me an immigrant. So they're very much like, if you are the child of an immigrant, that child is still an immigrant. And that to me is crazy because literally the verb to immigrate did not happen with that child. You know, like that person is not an immigrant. Like they were born in your country, but that kind of language continues, I think, to exclude and to otherize. And so I think that's maybe perhaps a bit emblematic, but they're different conversations for sure.
Okay, I have to go, but it was really great to hear this presentation. You remind me of why you were one of my favorite professors when I was actually a student here. I'm gonna let Dr. Waller take over, but thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Jasmine.
Okay, so the next question is from Joel and Kathy. Oh no, sorry, Hari. Maybe this is not a very relevant to our discussion, but I'll ask anyway. When I grew up, people used the word Muslim to talk about people whose religion is Islam. I don't hear the term Muslim anymore. Why is that, and how is the word used correctly?
So Hari, I don't think there's any problem with using the word Muslim. It's just that it's not colloquially used here. I think it was used more abroad, and sort of the more US way of saying it is with a U. So
That's interesting.
It's interchangeable. At least like when I do my searches in the news, I look for MUS and then MOS, and yeah, they come up interchangeably.
Well, my childhood was, so much of my childhood was spent in Canada, so that's where I heard it more.
There you go.
You've explained it. Okay.
Yeah.
Now I don't have to wonder anymore.
Yeah, there you go.
Thanks.
So the next question from Joel and Kathy: do you think a possible solution might be to join forces with organizations such as Black Lives Matter and other minority groups fighting for inclusion and equality? For example, no justice until there is justice for all.
Yeah, so this is a great question. I don't know if you guys have been paying attention to the progressive branch arm of the Democratic Party, but I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, but also like I marched a lot last summer in BLM protests. I wanted to understand what was motivating people to take time off in the middle of a pandemic when everyone was so scared about their livelihoods. The vaccine didn't seem like it was coming. Why were people marching? Who were the people marching? And also, like, what did they want? And while I was marching, I became very involved with like youth movements and trying to understand what the youth were looking for. And actually, I can go on a whole tangent about like young voters who are not going to vote because they feel so excluded. But the point being that actually BLM was very much in sync with other groups as well. And so there's been an effort, a very intentional effort between BLM and members of other groups to create a coalition, a political coalition in the progressive arm of the Democratic Party. So if you have a look at Bernie Sanders and the group that sort of surrounds him, and you look at Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and Abdul Sayed and these sort of like more prominent younger Muslims in politics, like they're not going the traditional route of getting elected by, you know, working with the Democratic, like just the main machine. They're working through progressive politics. And so that means creating alliances with the LGBTQ community. That means creating alliances with the AAPI community, groups that, and even of course, like a large Latinx population, especially young Latinx people who are very much involved in progressive politics. There is a new coalition that's formed that Muslims are incredibly involved in American politics. And I would say that this is sort of what's made them relevant in the post-2016 era politically. They've been actually able to make a difference, I think, in politics and speak up about things in ways that, you know, makes them more visible and more, you know, available to attack, of course, but also, you know, makes them more relevant in American politics, right? All of us know who Ilhan Omar is. All of us know who Rashida Tlaib is, not just because we're from Michigan, but we know, right? Americans know. And I think it's really much linking up with the progressive arm, which obviously has a really like large connection to the BLM movement. These are great questions. It's really fun to talk to you guys about this stuff. I care so much about this work, and sometimes you don't know if it makes sense in your head, or, you know, it helps to have these conversations, you know, to not feel crazy.
We do have time for a couple more questions.
But don't feel pressure. Please provide any any suggestions to places to live in Oxford as well, if you have any.
How many languages is your book published in so far?
Oh, only one.
Oh,
English,
published. I hope not.
It's
not
in English,
Swedish.
but not Swedish, but one was enough, right? That was the, I was lucky enough to get one.
All right.
Do you know Swedish? Did you learn Swedish when you went over?
I learned one phrase, which is "Jag talar inte svenska, pratar du engelska?" which means I do not speak Swedish. Do you speak English? And luckily, Swedes are so great with their English that they very quickly jump to English, and so one can survive. One can survive in Sweden. I don't eat fish though, so unfortunately, no herring for me.
No.
I have a fish allergy, so we can't bond over herring. But actually, last night, Sweden played in the Euro Cup against Spain, and it was a miracle that they tied. So Swedes are calling it a win.
Nazita, we spend so much of our time, I do in class, talking about all the wonderful things about Scandinavia. And as we often have a rather naive view of it. I think we are sometimes go overboard. There's a British writer who wrote a book called
Yes, you gave it to me.
People. That's right.
Yeah, you gave it to me.
What is your sense after having been there for a long time? Is it a place where you might want to ultimately?
Is it a utopia?
Yeah.
You know, I have to preface this. Like, I grew up in Orange County, California. You know, this was like Reaganomics, Reagan land. I grew up in a very sort of like fiscally conservative, socially conservative kind of area. And obviously academia like introduces you to a lot of progressive thinking and whatnot. And I thought I was so woke. And then I moved to Sweden and I thought, you want to tax me at what percent? You want to take 16 months of parental leave per child up until the child is 7 at your discretion and I have to pay for it? Or, you know, you want to have a subsidy for who mows your lawn and we have to pay for that? You know, 1% of my income has to go to upkeeping the church and all monuments. That's crazy. And I'm a convert. You know, I have to say I'm a total convert. I believe very much that it all is worth it. Life here is amazing. This is a beautiful, wonderful place. I really think it's a utopia in some ways. I think if you have privilege, this is a great place to have privilege. If you have a good job and you're, you know, if you're an academic here, life is nice. It's nice, honestly. I mean, there's no need to save because the government's always just going to take care of you. The tax agency has a rule that they always give you money back because they want to have high public opinion approval. Like, that's crazy, right? Parental leave, you know, as someone who is sort of in that generation of folks that's having kids right now, it's really fabulous. I mean, I have so many friends who are not only benefiting from it, but like people are forming really close relationships with their families. Vacation, you know, like I'm about to sign off for 2 months and go on vacation, which is great. You know, how many Americans can actually do that? Life here is, you pay for it. There's, you know, no one's going to be filthy rich. That doesn't happen. But it's, if you're a middle class person with, or middle upper class and you kind of have a stable job, it's a nice place to live. But it's also a terrible place to be an ethnic minority and to be poor. Mm-hmm. It's also a terrible place to be those two things at the same time. Yeah, and it's really, really terrible if you're undocumented. Because it's not like in the US where if you're undocumented, you can kind of still live a little. Here, it's like you can't access anything. Your social security number is your everything. Like you can't get anything. You know, in the US, I don't know if you guys know this, but there's a Supreme Court decision that said that the child of undocumented people can go to schools, go to public schools. That could never happen here. So, sorry.
Right. Wow, that's
a mixed bag.
A fabulously balanced answer. Thank you, Nazita. We have a question from Stan.
Hi, Stan. I like all your books. Can you guys hear Stan?
Yeah, we can't hear you, Stan. You seem to be unmuted, but we can't hear you.
Are you covering the speaker?
Nope.
Oh, do you want to type it into the chat?
Okay, that's a good idea.
Oh, now we can hear you.
Ah, yes, we did just hear you though.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's really distorted though.
Maybe the chat is the best way forward.
Nazita, just while Stan is typing, I'll send you another Zoom link.
Okay.
Okay.
Perfect. Well, it's really lovely that you have this space, you guys. I think this is so nice, and I'm so happy to have been a part of it. And thank you so much for coming. And it means a lot. I'm sorry again that you have to change your normal hour. Hopefully, it wasn't too much of an inconvenience.
Nazita, perhaps we could also talk because I'd really like some recommendations for other people you know who could be invited to speak.
Certainly. Are you only looking at the MSU community?
Mostly, but I mean, personally, I'm absolutely flexible on it, and I'd really like, input from participants about how we make changes going forward. Because I think it'd be lovely to have, the beauty of Zoom is that people can Zoom in from virtually anywhere on the planet.
Yeah, actually, I will send you guys. Sorry, just before we log off, I'm going to put in the chat a link to this website called minoritypolitics.netlify.app, and this is a link to a seminar series that me and two other assistant professors at MSU started. It's an online Zoom webinar that we've been doing on Tuesdays at 12 p.m. Eastern, and we're going to pick back up in August, and we have, academic talks, but we're actually starting something where we are doing one sort of social issue every 6 weeks or so. And so I think on September 7th, we're going to have a panel on the Roma. Oh, wow. And last month we had a panel on the Uyghur genocide. And the videos are all online. And so if you guys ever want to go back through the list and watch any of these videos, they're there. So that might be helpful. I don't know. I think the Uyghur genocide, at least for me, was really exciting. It's something I care a lot about, but I didn't know very much about. And so we had experts and dissidents and a human rights attorney, just people who are very much involved, somebody from the UN come and talk. And so at least that was really interesting. So if you are interested, please do sign up for our listserv. Yeah, and Dr. Waller, I can definitely send you a list of people. I can think about that a bit. I'm sure this is such a wonderful platform. People, I'm sure, would just love the opportunity to take part in it.
Yeah, thank you. And Sandy, that's a topic that we should think about as well for this link up between great ideas and town and gown. Marvelous. Okay. Speaking of websites, I'm just going to take the opportunity to put the link into the Senior Ambassador Program website. And it's far from complete, but there is a tab on there for Town and Gown, which has a majority of the previous sessions recorded. Sorry it's taken so long. I can't remember how many times I said it'll be up in 2 weeks, but there it mostly is.
Wonderful.
It'll be interesting to get the three-way comparison of the US, Sweden, and England.
Oh, I think so. Yeah. I mean, mind you, I am in academia in all three places, and I'm sure there's so much selection of just these institutions. And,
sure, right.
Yeah, but I think in terms of life experience, even in, but folks at Oxford have already been so kind, already invited me to stuff, and so it's really nice to be included.
Okay.
Amazon
Yeah.
has your book.
Mhm.
Sorry?
I said, Amazon has your book for $21.95, and I've got 3 ordered.
Oh, thank you.
I'm
I
going to
appreciate
make
your
sure
review.
a couple of representatives have copies.
I beat
Thank
you
you.
to it,
I appreciate that. Thank you guys.
John already has one.
I appreciate that. Dan, I see your comment here. Yeah, it's kind of funny when I first moved to Sweden, people the folks whose apartment I sublet gave me a book, and the book was all the moods that Swedes have, and it's like if they're happy, they have a neutral face. If they're sad, they have a neutral face. If they're angry, they have a neutral face. But if they're drunk, they're smiling. You know, and it's like that's what I've come to know about Swedes. Actually, it was very I think it was on point. I think they're the kinds of people who like meet their best friends in kindergarten, and if you come into their lives in junior high, you're sort of a newer friend. So God forbid you meet somebody in your 30s, because it's never going to happen, you know. But you know, kudos to them for maintaining long relationships. I guess we can all learn from that.
We lived in Melbourne, Australia for some years, and there a lot of our local friends, they had been nursed next to one another. So their friendships essentially began days after birth. And so, but it was the same phenomenon, the sheer difficulty of breaking into those established networks. Yeah.
Exactly.
We have time for one more question, if anybody has one. Okay. Oh. All right. Well, in which case, that just leaves me with the task of thanking you so much for a really enlightening presentation. And I mean, this is an astonishingly impressive work to take so many approaches to understand an underexplored issue. So many, many congratulations on the book.
Thanks so very much.
And yes, all the best in the near future. Thank you everybody for joining this session, and keep an eye out for emails about when we resume. But please do go to that the Senior Ambassador's website and register for the discussion series if that sounds of interest. And have a wonderful remainder of the summer.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
John, I'll wait for your email.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, bye-bye.